Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Mile End Institute. My name is Robert Saunders, and today we are exploring the history of British elections. We'll be exploring 190 years and 50 different election campaigns, thinking about how elections are won and lost, how they've changed over time, and what lessons we might learn for the future. We're doing this, of course, in a year of elections. In 2024, around 40% of the world's population will experience elections in their countries. And that includes the United States, Brazil, India, South Africa, Mexico, the European Union, and probably the United Kingdom. So it is the ideal moment to celebrate this new book, British General Election Campaigns 1830 to 2019. This is the latest in a series of volumes edited by the author, publisher, broadcaster, radio presenter and polymath Iain Dale. And we're delighted that Iain has joined us here today. So thank you very much for being with us.
Delighted to be.
We're also joined by two other special guests who know everything there is to know about the history of elections, Dr Jennifer Davey and Professor Philip Cowley. Jennifer Davey is a historian of the 19th century and is the director of the History of Parliaments Trust. If you haven't come across the History of Parliament, it is a wonderful organisation that was founded in 1940 and is the authoritative source for everything to do with MPs, constituencies, elections, peers, and other parts of the parliamentary system. Phil Cowley is the Professor of Politics here at Queen Mary. He has co-authored books on at least 3 general elections and is also the co-author of the very popular Sex, Lies and the Ballot Box, 50 Things You Need to Know About British Elections. We were hoping to be joined today by my colleague, Professor Tim Bale, but I'm afraid that Tim is laid up with COVID. So we are very grateful to Phil as Tim's stunt double for stepping into the breach at short notice. So we're going to chat a little bit about the book and about the history of elections, but we're also really keen to hear from you, our audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please just post it in the Q&A. I will keep a close eye on that, and I will put your questions to our panelists later in the discussion. But Iain, let's come to you first. Congratulations on the publication of the book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it and about what you were trying to do in this volume?
Well, I started this series with a book about every Prime Minister since 1721. It was time to coincide with the 300th anniversary of Sir Robert Walpole coming to power. And I was astonished that nobody had ever done this before. And so I got together 55 different authors, a mixture of academics, historians, journalists, politicians, and asked them who they'd like to write about, or actually asked them to write a particular chapter. And that was really successful. I mean, for a political book to sell, I mean, all different formats, over sort of 50,000 copies was quite something. So I then followed it up with American presidents, kings and queens. And then someone said to me, we were having a conversation about elections, and they said, well, what do we know about 19th century elections? And I said, well, basically half of them were corrupt. I suppose that's what we know about them, but not much beyond that. So I thought, well, how many elections have there been since 1832? And it turned out there were 48. So I thought, well, let's round it up to 50 and go back to 1830. So I've got the same format, sort of 50 different essays, one on each election, each one written by a different person. And I mean, the thing as an editor in these books is, you know that if you have that number of authors, they're not going to write in a uniform style. They don't actually need to. But the interesting thing about this book is that there is a bit of a uniform style. There's only 1 or 2 chapters, I would say, that are very different from others. Stephen Parkinson, now Lord Parkinson, he was Theresa May's political secretary in 2017. And so I gave him a bit more leeway. And I said, well, look, what was it like for you as participant in that campaign? And obviously, Simon Burns, the former MP for Chelmsford, he's written about the 1987 election, the first election that he was elected for. So that there are sort of slight differences. But I thought, given that I've I've just got the preface open here. Let me just read you a sentence or two from it. I say, I've delivered election leaflets, put up poster boards, canvassed voters, been an election agent, a candidate's aide, a campaign manager. I've been a brackets losing candidate, knocked up voters on polling day, driven voters to the polling station, attended 4 general election counts, hosted general election debates, interviewed election candidates, and hosted 4 8-hour general election night shows on LBC. The only thing I haven't actually done is ever won an election, but hey, you can't do it all. So I thought, well, if anyone's qualified to edit a book like this, it is probably me, and it's been an absolute pleasure to do.
Well, you've got a really remarkable range of elections in here. You've got landslides, you've got hung parliaments, there are elections in which there's a big dominating issue or cry, and elections that are much more fragmented and much more localized. I wonder, when you were putting all of this together, was there anything that really surprised you, or perhaps any elections that you found particularly interesting?
Well, I did find a lot of the 19th century ones interesting because I really didn't know much about them. What I've tried to do also in all of these books is have some very well-known names like Phil, but I've also got some people that nobody's ever heard of. I've got 1 or 2 of my LBC colleagues to write chapters, and the one on 1831 by Connor Hand, who's in charge of all planning in the LBC newsroom. I mean, I don't know how old he is, 27, something like that. He's not a historian, but I would challenge anyone to read this chapter and think that it wasn't written by a professional. And he's just given so much insight, because I tried to look at some of these early elections and thought, well, is it possible to write 2,000 or 3,000 words about them? And that there's very little about on 1830 or 1831. I mean, political history starts in 1832, as we all know. But he's done the most amazing job in writing and really bringing it all to life. And I think that's the case with a lot of these. I mean, look, we all know about the famous landmark elections of 45, 79. We know about the 1910 ones. And that's the only one where I got David Laws to write about both the 1910 ones. It seemed a bit odd just to sort of to have different authors for that. And the thing is that a narrative builds up about sort of why they became landmark elections, about why Clement Attlee won the massive majority that he did when no one expected it. And of course, everyone's now expecting 2024 to be a landmark election. And I think there are lots of indicators in this book that, I mean, some prediction. I mean, we all try and make election predictions, and we invariably get it completely wrong, no matter how involved we are in politics, no matter how clever we all think we are. Inevitably, you can't get everything right. But I think one thread that goes through all of this book is the question of timing and the calling of an election. And it is not an exact science. And obviously, we had the Fixed Term Parliament Act recently, but that's gone now. So it is up to the Prime Minister to decide when to call an election. And sometimes you can get it very, very wrong. And I mean, Margaret Thatcher, with her 2 landslide victories, she was incredibly cautious about when to call it. So, well, are people going to think it's too early if I do it after 4 years? She wanted to see what the local election results were like before making that decision. Well, Rishi Sunak is in a vaguely similar position in deciding the date of this election. And we all probably think we have a good guess when it's going to be. Nobody knows. I doubt actually whether he does.
Mm. As you've suggested, there are some elections here that will be quite unfamiliar, actually, even to historians. There isn't a large literature on the 1852 general election or 1935. And I wonder, having read and edited all of these essays, are there any big lessons that you've drawn about how elections are won and lost? Do you now know how to be a winning candidate in an election?
No, and I mean that wasn't the point of the book. I think that it really is looking at elections from a national point of view. Yes, I asked all of the contributors to write about campaigning methods, and obviously those have changed down the years. However, there are plenty of campaigning techniques that are used now, which were used in the 19th century as well. So not everything is new, but I mean, I can't remember which was your first the British general election of book, Phil, but a lot of the things that you would have been writing about in that, or your colleagues would have been writing about, would be very different from when David Butler started in the 1940s and 1950s. And obviously the internet now plays a massive role in election campaigning. I think this election, I mean, people thought, is 2001 the first internet election? I don't think it was. I think even 2010, you could argue, wasn't. But this one, I think, is going to be dominated by internet campaigning, which of course the parties love because it's so cheap.
Well, you've mentioned the 19th century, and I think this is a good moment to bring in Jennifer Davey. Jenny, you're our specialist in the 19th century, and that's probably the half of the book that will be least familiar to many readers. So are there any elections in the 19th century that you think are particularly interesting or you would particularly want people to read about?
I mean, they're all interesting. That's the first thing that I would say. I think Victorian elections are fascinating because they really help illuminate what wider political culture was like. And I think one of the images that we might have of Victorian politics and political culture is that it's incredibly elitist. Very few people had the vote and very few people had formal political power. But actually what we see in this book and in those elections and in those chapters is just how lively, participatory, and just how many people were involved in Victorian elections. That's the first thing that I would say. Favourite elections is always a difficult one. I think it's interesting that those kind of landslide, all those kind of key elections are always from the 20th century, but I think we can sort of identify similar kinds of elections in the 19th century that serve a similar purpose, let's say, to 1945. And so here you might think of 1880, for instance, and Gladstone's Midlothian campaign, where arguably you're really beginning to see the start of something that might look a bit more familiar in terms of a national election campaign, and that kind of process of appealing to a broader electorate.
So you've mentioned that far more people are involved in elections in the 19th century than we might think just by looking at the numbers who vote. How would women or non-voters have experienced elections, perhaps particularly in the early 19th century?
So I think one of the key things about 19th century elections is that they are incredibly lively. And I think that's slightly underselling the kind of boisterous nature of 19th century electoral culture. But these are kind of social community processes and events. It is a chance for people, electors and non-electors, to come together to think about their political representation. And that liveliness manifested itself in all sorts of ways, and we see this in the chapters in the books. But you get non-electors involved in canvassing. There was a particular role for aristocratic women there, who the kind of aristocratic men were unable to participate directly in elections because it was considered corrupt. There's slightly more leeway for aristocratic women. And you get all sorts of things. You get aristocratic women causing riots. In Ormskirk, they have paint, poured over them. They're, abused and heckled, which I think illuminates that liveliness, which often tipped into violence. So 19th century campaigns were often incredibly violent for all sorts of different reasons. One of the reasons that they were very violent is because huge quantities of alcohol were involved, right? So one way in which candidates would kind of appeal to the electorate and to the local community was through a process called treating, which is essentially just giving away vast quantities of food and alcohol. And often, where there is alcohol, trouble follows. So brawls, skirmishes were really common. But you also get kind of more organised electoral violence in the form of kind of hired roughs, where party organisations, various different kinds, would bring in people to kind of provoke. And then you'd also get the kind of more, I suppose, traditional from the 18th century, a continuity of kind of riot and rebellion, of people pushing, unenfranchised people pushing for more rights.
Can I just pop in on the women issue here, because what we found in virtually every essay, there's some little unknown fact or anecdote that's told. And of course, we all think that women first had the vote in 1918, which they did, but in the late 1860s, I think it was it's either a by-election or the 1868 general election, Mrs. Lily Maxwell became the first woman to vote in the UK because her name was erroneously put on the electoral roll. She found out that this was the case and decided that she would exercise her vote, and she did. And the law then had to be changed to make sure that it couldn't happen again, because of course it couldn't have women voting. So there's lots of little anecdotes like that I think bring all of these chapters to life.
Yeah, absolutely. You're quite right. So women didn't get the right to vote, or some women didn't get the right to vote until 2018, till 1918. We're a little bit more progressive than that. But what we do know is that women were able to participate in electoral culture, and that's women of all classes as well. So they're often the wives or the daughters and the mothers of electors are utilised by candidates or their agents as a way of persuading husbands or fathers to vote in the way that, you know, the local landowner might want to. So there's a huge kind of scope, even though there is no formal power.
And both your comments have picked up on the point that there's such theatrical occasions, 19th century elections. You've got rival brass bands playing in the streets. You've got colours and banners. There would be a public hustings at which the public can vote by a show of hands. There's beer pouring through the streets, all sorts of theatrics and colour. But there is another side to Victorian elections as well, which is perhaps more important for the outcome, which is the battles going on in the registration courts. That some readers might not be aware that actually getting on the electoral register is quite complicated, and that a big part of party conflict is just about registering your supporters and deregistering your opponents. And I wonder how much, Jenny, you think the result of elections actually depends upon that side of things, rather than this sort of wonderful theatre that we all enjoy looking back at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other stories that really comes through, which your point speaks to, Rob, is about the growth of kind of party organisation and that kind of attempt to professionalise approaches to elections and to make sure that the party, whichever party that is as well run as possible. And you see that to begin with at a local level, but then gradually, particularly after the passing of the Second Reform Act in 1867, you begin to see kind of national party organisations in the way that contemporarily we would now recognise really begin to kind of flex their muscle, I suppose, and begin to organise in a really systematic way. And I think the legacy of that has continued through the 20th century.
Well, that's a nice moment to bring in Phil, I think. Phil, do you have a favourite election or one that you like to talk about when you're teaching electoral studies?
Well, I think one of the things I think is most interesting about this, and we've touched on this a bit already, is that there are obviously these absolutely key ones, 1906, 45, 79. But they are important elections. They're not necessarily the important election campaigns. And when I was writing my chapter for Iain's book, this is one of the things that I found most interesting to try to tease out, was and I wrote on 2015, which I think is a very important election. And I can talk at great length, too long length, about 2015. When the book arrived, I was slightly embarrassed to discover that mine was one of the longer chapters and maybe I'd push the word limit right to the maximum.
No, that's a good thing.
Well, sometimes. But the campaign actually was really quite boring. Almost nothing happened in the 2015 election. Polls barely moved. There were very few incidents of real note. I mean, it includes things like, Labour's commandments put on that horrible piece of granite, and the moment where David Cameron confuses his football teams and so on. But it's really trivial stuff. Nothing seems to cut through. And yet that election in 2015, which then leads, because it gives a Conservative majority and sees this massive change in Scotland, I mean, it leads directly to the Brexit referendum a year later. So it's one of the most, I can think you can make a case that 2015 is one of the most consequential of the post-war era, but a really boring campaign itself.
Certainly agree on its consequences. And you make this point in your chapter that this was famously an election that the polls got wrong. And there are those who argue that the polls distorted the whole conduct of the campaign, because we spent the campaign talking about a hung parliament and who Labour might align with, rather than what a majority Conservative government might do. Do you think that polls loom too large in elections now? Have they become too important in electoral politics?
So the first thing I think is to say is that yes, they have. Too much reporting of elections is horse race reporting. Who's in front, who's behind, who's 1 point up, who's 1 point down. And not enough is about what parties are proposing, what the problems with policy A or policy B might be. Now, I have to say, having said this, that the counter argument is that if you took polls away, you would not get them replaced by high quality policy discussion. You would get them replaced by what Ollie the Octopus is pointing to and who's going to, you would get other sort of farcical discussion of the horse race rather than policy discussion. Readers on the whole don't want to read policy discussion, so that's why papers don't print it. But in general, I think they do loom too large in the coverage of elections. But a couple of other caveats on the polls, though. I think one of the most important things about polling is not necessarily what it does to the election contest itself, although it is important. It's that polls help us understand elections in a way that is available to us now and has been since the sort of 40s, 50s and later, in a way that bluntly isn't true of early 20th century elections or even 19th century elections. So to take one example, which only literally has only just occurred to me listening to this discussion, we talk about how vibrant 19th century elections were, and I understand that all the points you're making, but I wonder if we polled 19th century individuals, how many of you have gone along to one of these parties? How many of you have canvassed? Whether we'd actually still find huge swathes of the population that said no, in exactly the same way the 20th century population would say no if you asked it about its electoral engagement. Now, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. The truth is we just don't know because we don't have that data. And we do have that data about 20th and 21st, or late 20th and 21st century elections. And it has really helped dig into our understanding of what drives voters at the polls and shown that they're much more complicated elections than we used to think they were.
There certainly are Victorian cartoons of voters falling asleep while reading reports of elections, which might support that point. Another issue that you raise in your chapter is that I think 2015 was the first election in which a different party wins in each of the 4 nations of the UK. And I wonder whether you think that is an anomaly or whether that is a trend that's going to continue in future elections.
I assume insofar as any trend can be set to continue for the future. I mean, all trends continue until they don't. But I think it's going to continue in some form for a while. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, if the polls are right, at the next election, it won't be true in Wales. And Wales and England will have the same party, and maybe Scotland, we'll see. So we could see after the next election, all 3 parts of Great Britain having the same party winning. But the general fact that there is this volatility, I think, and sort of regional differentiation, I think is more likely to continue. I mean, one of the most obvious trends in the last 40 years in British elections has been the decline of party identification and the willingness of voters to switch parties, both short-term events, but also long-term, more cyclically. And I think that then leads to, and is in part caused by, what you see in Scotland and Wales.
I think that's a really important point about tribal politics. When the first election that I ever canvassed in was 1983, the Thatcher landslide. And I can remember I was responsible for the campaign in a particularly poor council estate in Norwich. And the number of doors you would knock on where people would say, oh yeah, we're a Labour family. We've always been a Labour family. We'll always be. We've always voted Labour. And similarly, in the sort of more plush areas, you'd get similar responses from Conservatives. Now, I haven't canvassed in an election for quite a long time now, but I suspect party canvassers get less and less of that as time goes on.
I mean, in a sense, it must be true, because this parliament that we're currently in has already seen the largest swing in opinion polls from a Conservative lead to a Labour lead since we started to have opinion polling in this country, right? Now, that volatility is not going to go, that's not going back in its box anytime soon. That doesn't mean it automatically swings straight back, but it does mean that voters are much more in play now than they were 30, 40 years ago. I mean, you talked about elections in the 19th century often being events about registration. In the mid 20th century, they were often mostly about mobilization. It was about getting your voters to the polls. It's why in the 1930s there is a huge debate about the motor car and attempts to regulate the use of the motor car in elections, because it's assumed that the Conservatives will have an advantage because they'll have more cars. Because all of that was about was identify. I mean, all of the Mikado system was about identifying your voters and getting them to the polls. Elections now, I'm sure they're still about mobilizing, but they also have to be about persuading.
Well, that takes us actually very nicely to the chapter that Iain wrote on the 1959 election, when new ways of mobilising and motivating electors are becoming important. And you make the point, Iain, in your chapter, that this was the first TV election, that some people might remember a young Tony Benn making his name fronting up Labour's TV campaigns. And I wonder how you think that television and modern communications have changed elections.
Hugely. And in a sense, there are a lot of parallels between 1959 and 1987, where you had a long-term Conservative government looking to be re-elected, with certainly in Harold Miller's case, a sort of charismatic prime minister, somebody who was reasonably popular. But during the campaign in both 87 and 59, there were wobbles for the Conservatives, and Gateskill ran a much more professional election campaign than I think had been done. And it wasn't just because of the television element to it, but they'd have half-an-hour party political broadcasts. And as you say, Tony Benn fronted them for Labour. And they were done in, I think they were pretended to be in Labour's election headquarters, were actually recorded in a BBC studio in West London. And if you've seen any of these, I mean, they are very, very slick, with sort of Tony Benn. The first image you get of him is he's sitting in a chair like I'm sitting in now, with his back to the camera, and then swivels round. Now that was groundbreaking stuff in 1959, and I think because everyone assumed, because of the polls, that the Conservatives were going to win. Most Tory strategists didn't really want to engage in the campaign very much. But as the polls started to close, there was a moment where they had to completely change strategy, just as there was in 1987, where they had Wobbly Thursday, Margaret Thatcher panicking, Norman Tebbit and David Young almost coming to blows about how the campaign should go on from there. And of course, it was just one road poll that provoked the panic, and things returned to normal, just as they did in 1959.
Just on that broader point, Rob, just to say, I think, because this, I think, draws out the point nicely, there is often an assumption that modern campaigns are sort of slick and professional, and those in the past were sort of clunky and terrible. And actually, that is not true. Political parties have always been really adept at latching on to technological campaigning, advertising, any modern technique, and grabbing it with both hands. That was true of poster development in the 30s, television, broadcasting. And actually, I remember doing one of the election books recently, talking to someone who worked for commercial clients as well as political clients, saying that in his experience, the political clients really got their money out of it. They knew how to maximize the bang for buck they would get from the techniques they were using. They've always been right at the forefront of using technological innovation.
But there have always been some, particularly on the left, that have been very uneasy about that technological innovation. And of course, the 1959 election also sees the Conservatives employing a PR agency. They're spending 5 times as much as Labour on the national press. And there are some on the left who feel that politics was being turned into a consumer good, something that you market in the same way you would market soap powder or breakfast cereal. And I wonder, Iain, do you think they had a point that does politics become more kind of commodified in that period?
Well, in a sense, but I mean, you are selling an idea, you're selling policies, you're trying to persuade people not to buy stuff, but to vote for you. And the similarity is obvious. And I think that this developed right through the 1960s and 70s. I mean, you look at Jeremy Thorpe, for example, who was leader of the Liberal Party in 1970 and 74. And I mean, he was a great showman. I mean, whatever became of him later, I mean, he was a really appealing politician. My mother was absolutely bewitched by Jeremy Thorpe. I don't think she was alone. And he used hovercraft because obviously his constituency in North Devon was very marginal at every election, and so he would use campaigning techniques which no one had thought of before. And there's always innovation at every election. There's always something different that one or other of the parties latches onto, and then the other parties, by the time they think of it, it's a bit late, and they use it in the next election, by which time it's very, very late. But I think the conventional wisdom is that 1979 was the sort of breakthrough in terms of marketing your policies as if they were soap powder. Margaret Thatcher she wasn't the first politician to do photo opportunities. I mean, we could probably all come up with examples from the 19th century where that happened, but she used them to convey, or basically to dominate the news. I mean, everyone remembers, I think this was actually 83 rather than 79, the picture of her carrying a cow and Dennis Thatcher saying, if you don't watch out, we'll have a dead cow on our hands. And it's sort of things like that where, and she was brilliant at exploiting these things. This wasn't a photo necessarily, but she was doing I think a factory visit or bakery visit, and she was sort of wearing the sort of hairnet that you wear in bakeries. And Robert Harris, who we now think of as a famous novelist, but at that point was a political reporter, he appears behind her doing a live report, and she then looks round and starts following him. And it was a very comic moment, but she was brilliant at exploiting opportunities like that, which, I mean, essentially humanized politicians, and she needed a bit of that at the time.
And someone who was particularly critical of that kind of retail politics was Michael Foot. And Michael Foot gave an extraordinary speech after the 1959 election in which he said this: "The Tories caught the mood of the country. Their votes prove it. But that mood was blind, smug, somnolent, and in some respects evil." And I think he felt quite strongly that politicians were pandering to the prejudices of the public rather than saying, this is where I stand, come with me. Is that just absurd moralism? Is that a strategy that cannot work in democratic politics?
It never is a good idea to insult the voters, and that's effectively what that comment was. I mean, he was correct to an extent, and if you look at modern day politics, it's very easy to argue that the Conservatives at the moment are exploiting the prejudices of the voters on things like Rwanda, which, I mean, we can all have our views on. I mean, I think it's disgraceful what they're doing, but that's what happens when political parties enter hard times. They resort to desperate measures, and the desperate measure that the Conservatives usually resort to is immigration. It's happened in countless elections over the years.
Well, Jenny, talking of desperate measures, you've already touched on the fact that elections in the 19th century could be fantastically violent, and people routinely die in elections, in riots. In 1859, I think the Liberal politician Robert Lowe is stoned by a crowd and dragged into a police station, which is promptly burnt down by the mob. How is that violence brought under control over the century?
I mean, Rob, you're really right. I mean, they're so violent. And, you know, I think the latest research, I think, suggests that there were 90 fatalities across the 19th century as a result of electoral violence. So, I mean, it's a very kind of real and pressing issue that policymakers are trying to resolve. And in a way, they don't manage it to begin with. It takes them a little while to sort of work out what it is that will really kind of begin to stamp it out. And so interestingly, you sort of get a kind of U-shaped curve rather than a kind of gradual decline over the 19th century, whereas it kind of decreases in the, I suppose, after the Great Reform Act is passed in 1832 and the professionalisation of the police, and then it kind of picks up again. And there is a real kind of outburst after the passing of the second Reform Act, which people, sort of, I suppose politicians slightly naively sort of think that once they increase the franchise a little bit, that will kind of dampen down people's passions, and that doesn't really happen. And 1868 is an incredibly violent election. But you do then begin to see things like the Secret Ballot Act in 1872. And I think one thing we haven't really spoken about, but we should just acknowledge, is the fact that voting for the majority of the 19th century was a public act. You had to show how you were going to vote. The Secret Ballot Act is an attempt to try and rid the system of a little bit of intimidation. It doesn't quite resolve the problem, so they end up introducing an act in 1888 against corrupt practices, which is a more successful attempt, I think, at legislating against it. But it does take them a while to get on top of it, which I think speaks to the kind of cultural element of that violence, that it is kind of part and parcel of how people understand elections in the 19th century. And certainly, things like bribery and the treating process and the vast quantities of alcohol. A lot of people think this is just kind of standard, but they don't necessarily see that there's a kind of issue in perhaps the same way that we might now.
And we worry a lot today about new technology and how that affects elections, whether that's AI or sort of data harvesting or social media. How do you see technology as changing Victorian elections?
Massively. And again, I think it speaks to what Philip and Iain were saying a little bit earlier about how politicians are often very adept at kind of responding to those innovations. So Gladstone is a really good example of that, right? Who fully, I think, him and his kind of liberal kind of acquaintances and that community around him really understand the power of the railway. You can begin to move around the country, right? The country becomes much smaller in lots of ways. It becomes much easier, but also the telegraph, right? It becomes much easier for speeches and hustings to be reported both on a local and a national level. And so there is a real immediacy that emerges to election reporting by the time you get into those closing decades of the 19th century. And somebody's put in the chat about a countess using cars for Labour candidates. The same would happen with railway tickets. So local organisations, national organisations would pay voters to get to the polls on the railway. So there are lots of different ways that technology is used in the 19th century.
We have a question actually from a member of the audience about whether you think that Trollope's depictions of elections are accurate or not. You might want to broaden that out to other fictional representations.
I think Trollope actually is quite an astute account of, he doesn't get everything right, but he's a novelist, so he's not trying to. But I think he's quite an astute observer of political culture. The other one that I would add in there is Dickens. There are lots of really great depictions of elections in Dickens as well.
Eaton's Will being particularly famous. Phil, it's often said that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. Do you think that's true?
I think that's broadly true. I read a fascinating draft paper recently by Stephen Fisher from Oxford, who attempts in a very parsimonious way to look at, I think from memory, it's all elections since 1918, and argues that in almost all cases, unless there is some massive economic downturn, you see the incumbent party re-elected, and there are one or two exceptions to that, but even in those, sometimes if the party has managed to replace its leader, it survives. So I think the general rule is that oppositions lose. The caveat that I've always thought has to be there is twofold. The first is that the opposition might lose, but the government the government might lose, but the opposition has to be one that people are willing to vote for. I think they have to make themselves acceptable for election. The second is, I think there's sometimes a difference between winning and winning big. And the one here that I always think is interesting is 1997, where there is a really interesting counterfactual about what might have happened if John Smith had not died in 1994, and would Labour still have won? And insofar as we can tell, and I think that, you know, there's a huge caveat there, because who knows? My view is that probably Labour would have won in 1997 or whenever the election is held under John Smith. But I don't think they'd have won the same way they won in 1997. I think a Smith victory would have been a very different thing from a Blair victory. It would not have completely discombobulated the Conservatives in the same way that 1997 did. It wouldn't maybe have led to 2001 in the same way. I think it would have been absolutely... So simply saying, do you win or lose, I think is one part of it. The one thing that we really have learned about elections, and particularly because there's another form of de-alignment, since parliamentary parties have become more difficult to handle, it's not enough to win with the majority of 20 or 21, for example, as John Major did in 1992. You need a decent buffer to enable you to govern properly. So I think that binary is important, but it goes further than that.
I think that there's another point about the size of majorities, because if we think back to 83, Thatcher had a huge majority, 144, but that was because the opposition was split between Labour and then the SDP Liberal alliance. Now, in this election, we all imagine, well, I suspect we all imagine there's going to be quite a reasonable Labour majority, even though Starmer hasn't enthused people in the same way that Blair did. But this is, I think, at least partially dependent, maybe wholly dependent on the performance of both Reform UK and the Green Party. Because if the Green Party take a lot of votes away from Labour in some constituencies, that could prevent a decent Labour majority, just as if Reform UK take enough votes away from the Conservatives, that could mean a massive Labour majority through nothing that Labour has actually done in some ways. It's the vagaries of the electoral system that would dictate this. So we might have a result next time that doesn't bear any relation to what we think it might be the day before the election.
We've got lots of really interesting questions coming in from the audience, but I just want to follow up that point about Labour. Phil, the Labour Party is notoriously bad at winning elections. I think only 2 people born in the last 120 years have led Labour to an election victory. And I wonder why you think that Labour finds it so difficult to win elections.
Yeah, there's a great quote. I think it's in Andy McSmith's book, written, 20, 30 years ago on Labour, which says something like that the Labour Party is one of the most successful successful political parties in Western Europe, except for its habit of not winning elections. Yes, you have to go back to, if you take out people called Tony Blair, you go back further than my lifetime before you have Labour winning a majority. And I'm no spring chicken anymore. Blair was the first Labour Prime Minister to win 2 consecutive periods in office, 2 full periods in office. The why, I think, is interesting. It's one I've never really got to grips with. I've always thought part of the answer lies in Conservative adaptability and Labour's consequent, or by comparison, Labour's lack of adaptability sometimes. Without wanting to make excuses for the Labour Party, it's also always faced a fairly hostile press. That's been true for all of its existence. Now, politicians have to deal with the press they've got, but it's still a problem. I think it is harder for Labour politicians. And the electoral system has not helped it at times. Although, as Iain's just said, depending on the election result, it could be that this time around the electoral system really does help Labour and really hurts the Conservatives. Beyond that, other than noting its lack of success, I struggle.
Well, I'm going to gather together some questions now and invite you to respond to whichever you think are most interesting or whichever you feel you have the most to say on. And one of them actually is about electoral systems. And it's about whether the adoption of proportional representation would transform electoral campaigns, either perhaps now or in the 20th century. Britain comes very close to adopting PR in 1918. And I wonder how elections might have looked different had that been the case. So that's one question. We've also had a question about whether British elections have become more or less candidate-centric over time, about the amount of attention that's placed on the attributes of individual parliamentary candidates rather than the national party. And then a third question in this round. Alistair Owens writes, there is a concern that if Rishi Sunak calls an October election, many students will find it difficult to vote. Are there examples from earlier elections where decisions over the timing of the election have significantly affected who is able to vote and therefore perhaps the outcome of the campaign? So, Iain, any of those that you would like to respond to?
Well, just a brief word about proportional representation, which traditionally sends people to sleep when you start talking about it. But I do detect there's a growing interest in the subject. Certainly on my cross-question programme, which we do 3 nights a week, you often get questions from callers wanting to know the panel's views on PR, which was not the case 2 or 3 years ago. I'm not sure. Let's say if PR had been introduced in 1918 or around then, would it have made a difference to the way election campaigning takes place? I find it difficult to argue that it would, because each party still wants to win a majority. Well, I mean, obviously, it's much more difficult under a PR system. So I'm not really sure that it would have any great impact on that. I think there would be far more focus on, well, what happens after the election? Who's going to get into bed with who? I mean, you look at the German system that they've developed over the years, and often you'll have the third or fourth parties deciding before the election what they're going to do. Well, there's something I can't imagine that happening here at all, but maybe it's because of the party system that's built up, because there's no doubt about it. If there was PR in this country, the Conservative Party would split at least two ways, if not three. Labour, probably there would be a sort of hard left party that would get a good percentage of the vote in each election. So it would transform our party system to that extent, but whether it would transform election campaigning, I have my doubts.
Thank you. Jenny, do you want to comment perhaps on the deliberate exclusion of voters from some elections?
Yeah, so there was a question, wasn't there, about prisoners, which, you know, historically has always kind of been, you know, part of, you know, citizenship and kind of criminal activity have been really closely aligned to each other for centuries. I also wanted to pick up on this idea of kind of whether or not elections have become more or less candidate-centric over time. I think in the 19th century, there is, at least probably for the first half, maybe, you know, there is a real focus on the candidate itself rather than the party or the party affiliation. And part of that is to do with the story of how parties develop over the 19th century. But that kind of local focus is, I think, quite important. And candidates are, you know, considered in a kind of local environment, and often it is the candidate's own abilities and skill and status in the constituency that often can be quite critical to how that particular constituency returns its MP.
So just picking up on that, Rob, I mean, obviously after I think you start with that. Then the 20th century, as you start to get mass parties, the party becomes increasingly important. And by the 1950s, the personal vote is considered to be 400, 500 votes in a constituency. I mean, almost all of it is delivered by the party and the national swing. You know, David Butler doing TV in the 50s and 60s used to be able to say, you know, you have 3 results in Cornwall, Bolton, and somewhere in the southeast, and he could basically tell you what was going to happen in almost every constituency in the country. And if that's the case, the candidate is counting for very little. That is definitely broken down. I mean, I think elections have become more candidate focused in various ways. But we still know that, you know, you're talking a couple of percentage points at the margins. Now, this is one of those things that I sometimes think academics get wrong, because they then dismiss this and say, oh, it's a couple of percentage points. If you're in a marginal seat, a couple of percentage points really matters. It was like there was a story recently about Conservative MPs being advised to shave off, male Conservative MPs being advised to shave off their beards to make themselves more electorally appealing. And this was sort of dismissed as if, you know, who would care? But, you know, you wouldn't want to wake up the day after polling to find that you'd lost by 2 votes, but you still had a magnificent shaggy beard, would you? So you know, you 1 or 2 points if you're the candidate matter a lot more than if you're some academic analysing election results.
Well,
Also, it'd be the other way around in Victorian Britain. Beards,
yeah, well, he did.
Be,
I mean, yeah.
Vote winners.
Yeah.
So a few more questions coming in. One, Audrey Tan asks, was voter fraud an issue in the Victorian era? And we might want to extend that to the 20th century as well. Has fraud ever been a big problem in British elections? Secondly, how important are manifestos in elections, and when do they start to become a thing? And then thirdly, how do parties recover from electoral defeats? Because sometimes that happens very quickly. The Conservative Party is smashed in 1945, but is back in power in 1951. And in some cases, it takes 3 or 4 elections to claw back a serious defeat. So, Iain, do you want to kick us off?
I mean, there is no recipe for recovering after a big election defeat. I mean, obviously, it took the Conservatives 13 years to get back into power after 1997, going through various incarnations. I think that a political party has to want to win to get back into power. And certainly in that period, I think people question really whether the Tories had an appetite to win. You had exactly the same thing with Labour during the Thatcher major years to an extent. And it was only really when Tony Blair shook everyone by the scruff of the neck and said, look, we can't change anything unless we're in power, that I think certainly the media took the Labour Party seriously again. And given what is likely to happen later this year, I suspect we're going to have a repeat of 97 with the Conservatives, where they turn in and probably, I mean, I hate the thought that they might elect someone like Suella Braverman as a new leader, because I think that would render them out of power for not just 2 terms, but probably a lot more than that. Political parties in the end have to be seen as electable, otherwise they have no chance of being elected, and that was obviously where Labour went wrong under Jeremy Corbyn. No sensible moderate person could imagine Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. And I think that goes slightly to answer Phil's question before about why haven't Labour won more elections. It is often the fact that the electorate can't imagine their leader as Prime Minister. I mean, if Neil Kinnock hadn't been Labour leader in 1992 and somebody more electorally appealing had been, I'm absolutely convinced Labour would have won that election. But he didn't pass the, can you imagine him on the doorstep of number 10 doing the where there is discord, may we bring harmony speech? People just couldn't. Similarly with Corbyn, they couldn't imagine him as Prime Minister. And that's why Keir Starmer, he may not be very exciting, but people can actually imagine him doing the job.
Thank you. Jenny?
So I think just building on from what Iain was saying, I think there's also a story about united parties and parties that kind of come together and look outwards. And I think that is also a feature that has kind of long roots. United parties are much more, I think, likely to win. On voter fraud, I think I would slightly broaden the question as well into just general corruption, of which there was a huge amount in Victorian Britain, which leads to lots of kind of contested results, which is a feature of the kind of electoral culture in the 19th century. And there is a real concern about that. So alongside this kind of very violent culture that you see in the 19th century, you also have a culture around corruption in a broader sense, which is to do with trying to influence, alter how people are voting. And so that is also a kind of concern that looms large, particularly as you move into the latter half of the 19th century.
Yes, and particularly before 1832 as well, you have the phenomenon where large numbers of voters will be brought in from outside the constituency, sometimes blind drunk, but sort of delivered in carriages to go and vote. Phil?
Well, that's the equivalent of postal voting, I think. But fraud is a really interesting one in modern elections, because of course this general election we are going to be required to produce photo ID when we vote, or a form of ID. Personally, I'm not a fan of this. I think it's an excessive reaction to the problem. There have been some cases of fraudulent voting in British elections, but very few. That said, I'm always a bit wary when people say, oh, there have only been two convictions, because voter fraud cannot be the only crime where the number of cases of the crime equal the number of convictions. I mean, that's not true of any other crime, right? I mean, the police don't catch every case of any other crime. I don't see why they would be in this case. So the number of cases is probably higher than we actually see in the conviction rate. But it can't be that much higher, or we would have lots of stories of people turning up to vote and then finding that their vote had already been cast.
Well, we do have lots of stories. I mean,
we don't have lots, Iain.
Well,
we have more. I mean, I'm with you on this in a sense, but we don't have lots. Well, personally, I don't think we have enough to justify voter ID.
Anecdotally, in the various elections that I was involved in, on election day, the campaign headquarters would be assailed with phone calls from people saying, I've just been to vote, they won't let me because they say somebody already has. Now, I can't say whether that's 10,000 over the country or 100,000 or whatever, but it's a more significant number than we're led to believe just by, as you say, the number of convictions. Because how do you actually prove it? I mean, unless you've got CCTV at each polling station, you can identify the person who has impersonated. I mean, how on earth can you then prove it?
Well, it's very difficult to catch them, but you could prove that someone had come and voted for you, and the number of people who actually prove that at each election is pretty small as well, right? That's why I'm a little bit skeptical about some of these claims. Anyway,
we could count the number of tendered ballots, but I think we'd probably better move on. Does anyone want to say anything about the role of manifestos?
Well, as the editor of British Election Manifestos 1900 to 1997, 3 volumes, one for each party, I mean, I must admit, by the end of that process, I lost the will to live, because they are generally not very interesting documents. I mean, people imagine that the Tory 1979 manifesto was really radical. It wasn't at all. There were very few promises in it whatsoever. Labour's 1983 one certainly was. There's part of me that now thinks that manifestos have kind of had their day. But if you didn't have a manifesto, you'd have to have something where the parties would at least give a broad indication of the direction of travel, even if they weren't going to go into huge detail. I mean, at the moment, I do a monthly phone-in with Rachel Reeves, but it's a game of cat and mouse where I'm saying, well, what, so you've got to give a bit more detail. Oh, I'm not going to develop my election manifesto on your programme, Iain. I thought, well, yeah, but there's 6 months to go. The electorate do generally, they don't just want the direction of travel, they want a little bit of meat on the bone. And at the moment, Labour have been very, very successful in not really putting any meat on the bone.
Let me, Rob, end with a positive note, which is that all the political science evidence is that, by and large, a party with a majority will deliver the vast majority of its manifesto.
Always good to have a positive note towards the end of a session. Perhaps a final question to put to each of you, or 2 final questions. Firstly, are there any elections that you think might offer some useful parallels to the election we're expecting later this year or early in 2025? Are there elections you think it might look like? And then secondly, if Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer were to call you up on the phone and ask you for some advice, drawing on your knowledge of electoral history, what do you think you would say to them? Iain?
Wow. I mean, the predictable answer is the one I'm afraid I'm going to give, in that I think if you look back at certainly elections since 1945, at the moment you'd have to say 97 looked possibly the most similar. But I think, look, I do believe Labour are going to get majority. Do I believe that these 2 recent polls showing that they're going to get 468 seats or whatever are accurate? No, I don't. But you'd have to say that something along the 1997 result is probably more likely than anything that we've seen before. In terms of advice to Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, you can't change politicians' personalities. I mean, Keir Starmer is not a particularly captivating politician. I always describe him as charismatically challenged. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think if Boris Johnson had still been Prime Minister, people would have seen that as a real asset for Keir Starmer, because if you look back to 1945, you normally have a charismatic Prime Minister followed by a dull one, followed by a charismatic one, followed by a dull one. Well, of course, here you might, I mean, I don't know, you wouldn't describe Rishi Sunak as charismatic. Would you describe him as dull? Well, probably more on the dull side, I suppose. So if Keir Starmer wins, he's probably going to break that pattern. So I think he's got to zhuzh himself up a little bit between now and the election. He's got to show that he enjoys the election campaign, because I think it is a real, we always know when politicians aren't enjoying themselves. You can just tell. And I mean, Gordon Brown, I don't think ever really enjoyed election campaigns until he did. And there was a moment even in 2010, right towards the end, if you remember that speech he gave, I think Methodist Central Hall, you could see he had started to enjoy himself after all of the terrible Mrs. Duffy debacle. So I think, I don't think I've got any particular advice to Keir Starmer, apart from appearing maybe on more daytime television shows and making himself more appealing to the so-called ordinary voter. And Rishi Sunak, I'm afraid, game's up, mate.
Jenny.
Probably sacrilege, isn't it, as a 19th century person to say 1997, but it does, and I wish that wasn't my answer in lots of ways, but it does feel a little bit like that might be the way it's heading. Historians, I think, are probably not best placed to give advice to politicians, but potentially, I think things change, and big majorities, big landslides can be overturned. And also it is thinking about what happens next, right, for both parties, going back to that point about why parties may win or lose elections.
Thank you. And Phil, bringing us to a close.
So in elections, I'm going to say none of them. I suspect this is going to not look like any 20th, or at least post-1945 general election. I don't think it will resemble 97. I think there'll be a lot of very striking differences. I just think it will be unique, and we should stop seeing it in terms of whether it's going to be like 92 or 97 or somewhere in between. In terms of the advice, I mean, I'm tempted to say don't listen to academics, but the other bit, there's a famous law about some bloke, some American, who was asked why he robbed banks, and he said because that's where the money is. And I think politicians' advice that you go where the voters are. And that would be my piece of advice to both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. It's astonishing how often political parties pitch policies and ideas that are not actually where the voters are.
Thank you. We are out of time, sadly, but it's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today for this discussion and for the very interesting questions. If you want to find out more about the history of British elections, then you can find British general election campaigns 1830 to 2019 in all good bookshops. Please do sign up to our mailing list at the Mile End Institute if you're not already with us. We have a number of events coming up, including a discussion of the Conservative Party and climate change, and an event on how British politics is seen from outside Britain, bringing together a number of foreign correspondents and newspaper journalists working in other countries and looking at Britain from outside. It would be lovely to see you at many of those events. Thank you for joining us today, and a special thank you to Iain Dale, Jennifer Davey, and Phil Cowley. Enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you very much.